Are you a fan of the finer things in life? Well, of course you are. You're listening to my voice right now. I have some good news for you. If you're a fan of high-class, delicious Italian coffee, I have a promo code for you. If you check out Lorenzotti Coffee at lorenzotti.coffee and use the promo code The Mad Ones, you can get 10% off their fantastic beans. So join us, lorenzotti.coffee, promo code The Mad Ones. You are watching an MLGA Network live broadcast. The only people for me are the Mad Ones.
The world is filled with the boring and the barely conscious.
And misery loves company.
But we don't have to live this way.
Jessica and I are here to talk to those the system rejects, to radicals and thought criminals.
The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but push the boundaries of acceptable discourse.
Those who stare reality in the face and dare it to be different.
History isn't made by the timid, and fun is not had by the perpetually afraid.
We are the Mad Ones.
So let's get to it.
Welcome to the Mad Ones. I'm your bourbon-swilling, buck-knife-wielding host, Cam Harless, and with me, as always, is our soup and horror enthusiast hostess, Miss Jessica Green. How you doing, Jessica?
I'm good. How do you do?
I'm doing really great. We have an exciting guest tonight. In fact, before I do his introduction, I'm gonna have to take a deep breath. So, let's do this. All right. Tonight we're joined by a titan on the side of liberty, the anti-war voice on the radio, in print, and online, the source to almost every anti-war argument I have ever made, author of Fool's Errand and Enough Already, editor-in-chief of antiwar.com, the head of the Libertarian Institute, the Enclyclopedia Brown of Foreign Policy, a historian of the now with almost 5,500 interviews under his belt, and the voice that keeps Bill Kristol awake at night, Mr. Scott Horton.
Hey, how are you guys doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for this because we've had some really cool people on, but I think I'm the most nervous right now because since I became libertarian, since I started listening to Ron Paul and Tom Woods, I was just like, I remember the first time I listened to a Tom Woods episode with you on it, I was like, this dude knows so much, and it's so incredibly impressive. The fact that you can talk through all of these different foreign policy points over the last 50 years, 60 years in chronological order without skipping a beat. So for starters, do you have a photographic memory? Because I don't know how you do it, because I could never do that.
Yeah, I do have a very visual memory. And I mean, really, honestly, my cheat is that, when you mentioned I am right at 5,495 interviews right now. So it'll be 5,500 this Friday.
Wow.
But almost all of those from 2003 all the way through 2016, those interviews were just clipped out of my show, which was a live radio show, which had interviews, but it was also just me talking most of the time. And so that's my big cheat, was I've been not just reading antiwar.com every day, but I've been essentially, for most of this time anyway, I've been teaching what's on antiwar.com every day for years and years and years. And also, one of my jobs at antiwar.com was I was the one who put all those links in the Justin Raimondo articles. So for people who remember how that was, in the Bush years and in the Obama years, where it's absolute overkill of shiny red hyperlinks in Raimondo articles, that was me putting all those in there. So that's like a deep dive for 3 hours a night, 3 nights a week for 10 years straight or something like that. So that's a lot of, I put my time in, I guess, in terms of all of that. And then also, I guess I can picture years pretty easily in my head. I can picture decades and time and whatever different shapes and things. So I can always remember what month an article came out, because I can kind of see it in my head of what time, it was. So, that I guess is a little bit of a cheat for me that helps me with the names and dates and keeping things straight.
I think what makes it so hard for people to kind of parse these things out is that there is an information overload, and to have someone to put things in a chronological order really is helpful, because so much of this is part of my own memory coming up through childhood and young adulthood, but I don't have the ability to like put them all in order like that. And when you do have them in order, things start to become clear to you. And so that's like a huge service that you've provided me personally. Because
great. Well, that's the whole point. That's exactly the point. Is I'm not really trying to do like breaking top secret stuff that you don't know. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but basically, like you and your dad and everybody knows that Ronald Reagan backed Iraq against Iran in the 1980s. But the question is, who cares, right? What does that have to do with anything? And then, so my answer is, well, see, if it wasn't for that, then it wouldn't have been this. And then if it wasn't for that, then this thing wouldn't have happened, which is the cause of the thing. And then, so in other words, I guess in that same, to your back to your first question about my visual memory and imagination here, I kind of project that onto everybody else too, right? Like everyone has some kind of timeline of what history looks like, however it's shaped in your own mind. I don't know, but there's some kind of timeline going back to the Carter years, right? So all I'm trying to do is fill in enough puzzle pieces that you get to that moment, as you were just talking about, where you go, oh, okay, now I get it.
Right.
Now it makes sense why they do these crazy things that don't make sense. Is they're trying to make up for the thing they did that didn't make sense before that. You know?
Well, and that's what's interesting. Is what's great is, I was born in the late 80s. And so by the time high school came around and we started talking about, the Soviet Union and the Cold War and all of that, first off, none of the stuff that you talk about is mentioned because it's not the approved narrative from the state. But on top of that, there's a lot of stuff that I may have lived through, but I was too young to actually have any memories of. And so you inspired me. It was directly you inspired me a year ago to dig into Ruby Ridge and Waco and do very condensed retellings of those. And so like I can't tell you how many things I read from you or listened to episodes that you did. Jim Brevard is a wealth of knowledge, and like I used him, Verify, and I did all of this. And right after that, I spent probably 2 months, the first 2 months of last year, like just in Waco and living through it in this kind of not personally, but like through other people. And so I finished Waco and I was just in this emotionally battered place because I was like, this was horrifying. This was terrible. And I actually emailed you and I was like, hey, I want to do Oklahoma City next. And you were like, here, you can use these files that I have. And I looked at the files and it was, over 1,000. And I was like,
oh, that was you. Okay. I remember that.
And I looked at those and I was like,
few. It's hard to keep track. Everybody has their own name and their internet name and their email name. And anyway.
But I looked at that just dearth of knowledge and I was like, I don't know if I'm emotionally prepared for this yet. And so I've put that on the back burner. And Jessica and I were actually talking about it earlier. Is that's what we really want to dig into next is Oklahoma City. And so I thought, everyone who has you on to their show is always like foreign policy, which is the most important libertarian thing is war, period. But this domestic policy that I feel like things are, they may just be getting worse right now. And I think you can, if you look back in history, you can see where Ruby Ridge was a big part of that in Waco and Oklahoma City. But the first time I ever interacted with you was on Twitter because I watched an Oklahoma City bombing documentary and I saw a picture of Timothy McVeigh selling bumper stickers outside of Waco, and they had a swastika and a hammer and sickle on them. And I did not understand who the hell sells that. And I was just like, I'm going to message Scott. Do you know why he sold these things? But due to that, I would love to hear, since you are older and you lived through these things, I think you graduated. I was listening to you on Josh Smith last night, and you said you graduated in 95. So like all of these stories are ones that you'd remember with clarity. And so I'm curious about these, and I would love to talk about that, especially with the anniversaries coming up this month.
Sure.
I'd love to dig into that if you'd be interested.
Well,
in that.
listen, I mean, I was just a high school kid when Oklahoma happened. So, you know, all the credit here goes to JD Cash and a lot of other writers and investigative reporters from that era who did all the heavy lifting here. There's a guy now named Richard Booth, who I think is a really great journalist who's working on a book that we're going to publish later this year at the Libertarian Institute. And this is his single issue. So, and I really like his aesthetic. He's got a real journalistic take on this. He's not a kook either way. He's a real careful guy, and he's assembled a mass of documents. If you go to libertarianinstitute.org/OKC, that's everything that I had given you the keys to back then. Yeah. Which, hang on, let me close this window because I got crickets and trains and things.
Yeah, no worries.
No worries.
I thought maybe I'd get some fresh air during this, but no. Yeah, no, the deal is that, so anyone can find all the original source material and then all the best journalism. All that is at libertarianinstitute.org/OKC, and you can go take a look at this stuff yourself. But, you know, essentially the story is there were a lot of people who knew they were lying from the very beginning about what had happened. And the ATF was not there when they were the target of the attack. And all of a sudden they show up in battle gear, you know, 15 minutes after the bomb goes off, and then tell a bunch of lies about what heroes they were and all this kind of thing. But meanwhile, I think 19 kids were killed in the daycare center. And so how come the ATF got a warning not to be there, but the kids in the daycare center didn't get a warning? And this kind of thing. So there was, from the very beginning, it was like that. And there were also accusations that it must have been Muslims who did it. And so then there were conspiracy theories about, I guess, an Iraqi guy and his Palestinian house painting crew that were falsely accused of having something to do with all this. And there were just a lot of red herrings, but there was a lot of interest. And see, here's part of the political dynamic, and you'll be familiar with this, the way it's taking place now, the way they're demonizing the entire kind of populist right in the name of the January 6th riot at the Capitol. The insurrection, as they call it.
Right. How many insurrections don't include guns? Like that made no sense to me.
Well, look, I mean, it's not about making sense. It's about trying to smear people and make giant category errors. Like the believers of QAnon are equivalent to the American right, or even the American populist right. And then the American populist right is equivalent to the entire American right, including the conservatives and the rich old country club guys and whoever, which is all just nonsense. Right. It was the same thing they did in 95, is they said, you know, it wasn't just everybody to the right of Rush Limbaugh. It was Rush Limbaugh did it. It was, you know, which I don't know how people understand that. To me, he represents one hair to the right of center, right? This is establishment conservatism. And Bill Clinton blamed him for it, and blamed essentially every white guy with a gun in the country for it, who had, you know, nothing to do with it. And then more narrowly, they blamed the militia movement. And importantly, this was the militia movement that grew up in reaction to Waco. And the thing of it was, the only connection to the militia movement at all was that McVeigh had shown up at a meeting of the Michigan militia, and they had told him to beat it because he was a Nazi and they didn't want anything to do with him. And then from there, they went on and said, look, all the militias are Nazis. They're all racists. They all hate blacks and Jews, and they all want a giant race war against the government, and they all worship Hitler and all of this. Meanwhile, the reality was, the militias that had risen up, especially after Waco, and there had been some before Waco, but especially the ones that came after Waco, they were avowedly not racist. And in fact, like I knew some of these guys, you know, in Austin back in the day. There were, you know, plenty of them around the Access Channel kind of community and whatever at the time. They didn't talk about blacks and Jews. I mean, they talked about the Rothschilds and the New World Order, but to them, Rothschild wasn't a code word for Jew. It was a family of bankers who have a lot of political power. And probably most of them didn't even know the Rothschilds were Jewish and didn't make the connection to Zionism or any kind of thing. It was the Rockefeller, the Rockefellers are Presbyterians and Baptists and Catholics and stuff. They're not Jews at all. And they were always, as even Murray Rothbard said, he called it the Rockefeller World Empire. They were the conspirators. And in the John Birch kind of populist right conspiracy theory history, it's the Rockefellers, not the Jews, who were really like at the core of the New World Order conspiracy anyway, right? So if you hung out with these patriots in the 90s, they just weren't talking about blacks and Jews. They just weren't. I was there. I know these guys. And that wasn't their thing. It just wasn't. But then you ask Bill Clinton and TV news, and they go, all militia guys are Nazis. And all conservatives are militia guys. This just whole thing. Smearing the entire right wing as the radical right. Meanwhile, the reality was McVeigh had 6 or 10 friends who actually were Nazis, who were not militia guys. They were literal swastika tattoo skinhead bank robbers, like essentially prison Nazis, right? Aryan Republican Army from the prisons. That kind of branch of radical rightism that's the origin of it, right? Is from American prisons. So these guys weren't militia guys. They were Nazis, which is a totally different category of activity, essentially, right? These were like real ass skinheads. And so they had a bank robbery ring, and it was the ARA bank robbery ring were the ones who helped McVeigh do it, apparently, allegedly, quite seemingly. And then the reason that they all got away with it was because the ATF and the FBI both had investigations into the groups that did it, but then didn't stop it. And the ATF wanted to make a move, and the FBI stopped them and said, we'll handle this, but then they didn't handle it. And seemingly one of the major flaws in their operation was just the Nazis rented a second truck. You guys got a GPS and you're following around a Yellow Rider truck? We'll just get another Yellow Rider truck. And then these cops are just a bunch of meathead idiots. They don't know. So the bomb squad shows up at 8 o'clock in the morning. They hang out for 45 minutes or so, and then they leave. And then the truck pulls up at 9. But look, I mean, I can't sit here and tell you like a narrative from beginning to end of here's what happened, here's who did it, here's how they did it, and we know these, for a fact. What I can do is I can bring up things like, well, we know that there are 24 eyeball witnesses who saw McVeigh in Oklahoma City that morning, and that none of them were called to the stand to testify against him. And that's for the simple fact that all 24 witnesses saw him with somebody else. Everybody who saw him with somebody else. And then the government just didn't call him and didn't even look that way. And in the book, Oklahoma City by Gumbel and Charles, the U.S. attorney admits that, and they spin it, that, well, we were afraid that we would jeopardize the capital case, the death penalty case against McVeigh if we went after everyone, because then that would give his lawyers room to say there's reasonable doubt. Maybe McVeigh was just the dummy and the patsy who'd been put in the driver's seat, but maybe there was these other men who had masterminded it who were more guilty than him somehow. And so as they admit, as they put it, this is their excuse. And by the way, as I already said, the real reason I think is because these guys were all known to the cops. They were all flipped state's witnesses and undercover informants, and both ATF and FBI had investigations into these Nazis before they did it. And so that was why they covered it up. But then their excuse for covering it up, because they essentially admit that they covered it up. And then their excuse is, well, but we didn't want to jeopardize the death penalty case against McVeigh, which, by the way, that's not for them to decide, right? Like they are mandated that they shall pursue the enforcement of the law. That's it, right? That's the president's job and theirs on down. That they shall faithfully execute the law. And by the way, if you're really concerned that McVeigh is going to not get the death penalty because you prosecute everybody involved, that's really your excuse, well, see what happens, and then press your luck when it comes to the state, and make sure that the state prosecutors, because the federal prosecution was only over the 8 federal employees who died, and then the rest were, I guess, whatever state workers or whatever, whoever else the people were in there. There's only 8 people that they were prosecuted for in federal court. And then Terry Nichols, the co-conspirator, was tried separately on state charges. And because he wasn't convicted of a death penalty offense, he was barely convicted at all. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, in fact. And that was why they prosecuted him twice, because they wanted to get the death penalty against him in Oklahoma. So they could have done the same to McVeigh. They could have said, you know what? Oops, we prosecuted so many people that the guy who was most guilty, the jury for some reason didn't want to give him the death penalty, which I think is crazy. The jury would have given him the death penalty anyway. He was the one driving the truck. He's as guilty as hell, no matter who put him in that driver's seat. He was as responsible as anyone, at least. So they would have given him the death penalty anyway. That's no real excuse. But even if they really thought that, well, they still have a whole other trial to go on the state level then. And all the time in the world they need to put that case together, because he's going to be convicted of something, you know. So it's a completely hollow excuse. But they admit it. I mean, in the book, he says, the prosecutor says, oh, I got it right here.
Love that you have the book right there.
Larry Mackey, he says, privately, Mackey never stopped wondering if others were involved, and said many of his colleagues felt the same way. This is the U.S. attorney, okay? If you had said to us, anybody in the room 100% confident that McVeigh was alone, raise your hand, we would have all kept our hands in our laps. Okay, so this is the way he phrases this weird double negative. In other words, raise your hand if you think that we, the federal prosecutors, let the guilty butchers of 190 people, 180 people go free, 170 people go free. Raise your hand. They would have all had to raise their hand. Yes, we were all guilty accessories to mass murder. That's what he's saying. He's admitting it. Larry Mackey, the U.S. attorney, is admitting he let the guilty go free. He let the guilty go free. So I don't need to be a conspiracy nut on it. There you go. And he knows as well as I do that, you know, who the guilty were. And they're, you know, Danny Colson, one of the FBI agents involved, has repeatedly called for a new grand jury to reinvestigate and indict the guys who did it, et cetera. So
do you know about this woman from the Secret Service who was apparently almost investigated because she abused her powers in terms of looking into some of the other people who were involved in this? And then very quickly, Mary, I can't quite remember the last name, and I left my notes in the other room, but that she was a Secret Service person who was investigating this, and very quickly they cut the Secret Service out of the investigations, but that she had been trying to look into these other co-conspirators and very quickly was moved out of the investigation and no longer works for the Secret Service as a result.
I don't know about that, but it could be. I mean, I know that the Secret Service, there are documents that come from the Secret Service, you know, wires and communications back and forth and all that have been released. I don't think I'm familiar with that story, but there are a lot of threads to the Oklahoma case. I mean, it's a, oh, and I'm sorry, one more thing here. This is a tangent I went on, but I forgot to tie it up, was when they blamed the entire political right and blamed the militia movement, especially, well, that motivated the militia movement to say, well, screw you. It wasn't us, it was them. And that was how, from the very beginning, from 1995 and 1996, and the very beginning of it, the kind of radical right, very broadly defined radical right media was telling the story of who these guys were and what their names were. Because no, they weren't militia guys, but they were close enough that it wasn't too hard, because Jimmy knows Tommy and Tommy knows Bobby, and they know who did it. And so it was all over. If you read the Free Republic, or, you know, the John Birch Society magazine, the New American, or, you know, a lot of those kind of right-wing magazines at the time. I think I'm almost certain that Guns and Ammo did some stuff. I know they did a lot on Waco. I think Guns and Ammo did some stuff on Oklahoma too. Like, who are all these guys? I mean, we got all their names. And why are we pretending that we don't know who did this?
Yeah.
And do you feel think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Cam.
No, I was just gonna say, do you think so? Ruby Ridge was clearly a PR nightmare. Waco was, from everything that I've read, a they tried to fix their image so that they wouldn't lose funding and get moved out of the Treasury Department, the ATF. And then that became an even bigger PR nightmare, which really led to this kind of fervor against the state and against the federal government. Do you think that with the way things went with naming Timothy McVeigh explicitly and having that scapegoat, that helped kind of bring down that movement that was frustrated with the state?
No question. And listen, it's the same thing with the 9/11 truth stuff. You know, I don't think Dick Cheney brought those towers down, but he might as well have. And it's the same thing with Bill Clinton and his government and Oklahoma City. I don't think, and I did when I was younger, but I don't think that they said, oh, good, a plot against a building, let's let it happen so that we can exploit it and blame the radical right. I don't think they did. I don't think it was like that. I haven't seen any evidence that they deliberately pulled their punches in that way.
Even
but
if
they might as well have
deliberately, right?
They might as well have, because what they do from that day and for the next year, they blamed every white guy with a gun in the country did it. And in fact, what they did more than anything, what they did was they rationalized Waco, and they made it where they told this story where the average American, you know, they wouldn't say it like this in English all the way thought out loud because it would break down and not make sense. But essentially the spirit of the thing is that the Branch Davidians got in a time machine and blew up the Oklahoma City Federal Building. And that's why they deserved to die back 2 years previously. Fuck them. How dare they do that? And so then if you said anything about, man, Waco, then people would say, oh, yeah, well, what about Oklahoma City? Like, it was a, you know, hypnosis. And I know this from driving a cab. You know, I drove a cab for years. And there's like new developments in the Waco case would continue to come out. There's the whole reinvestigation and cover up of 1999 and all of this. And so I would talk to my customers. And if you just said Waco, I hate it when people talk second person. If I just said Waco, they would go, what about Oklahoma? Like as an involuntary thing, like they're trained like a monkey that they have to say, what about Oklahoma? Well, what about Oklahoma? Tell me one thing about Oklahoma. If McVeigh did it just like they say he did, as revenge for Waco, then you tell me how that justifies Waco. Explain to me in any rational way how that makes it okay what they did to the Branch Davidians, who were not Nazis, who were not attacking anyone, who had not harmed anyone. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to make sense. It's all about building an excuse, having a way to rationalize away having to care about it. Look, if Waco was bad, then my security force is my enemy, and I'm in a real bad spot. But with Oklahoma City, it goes to show, as they call it at Georgetown University, the rally around the flag effect. War, this is our slogan at antiwar.com. War is the health of the state. When the government is attacked, they love nothing more than to say, oh, boo-hoo for me. Boo-hoo for government. Rally around the state. And I'll tell you, I got the exact quote here too. Let me find. I got it. You guys got me all pissed off. You didn't even warn me we're talking Oklahoma City today.
Well, it's something I'm passionate about. And it's something that like just ruined me last year.
Where is this? Oh man. The question is whether I'm going to be able to find the quote right where I want it. But I think it is right at the start. Yeah, because this is, here we go. It's got to be right here, right? There you go.
Nice.
Oh, man, it's poorly paraphrased here, actually. He only has part of the quote. It's Ambrose Evans Pritchard from The Telegraph. He says, relaxing on Air Force One after the 96 elections, Bill Clinton told a pool of reporters that he owed his political revival to the Oklahoma bombing. He was in a reflective mood, looking back at the ups and downs of his turbulent presidency. As so often, his thoughts lingered on those first painful months after the Republicans captured both houses of Congress for the first time in almost 2 generations. It had been a stinging rebuke for the White House. But then that bomb went off. Quote, it broke a spell in the country as people began searching for our common ground again, he said. And you know what? There's a better quote of that somewhere, because he's right that this was on Air Force One, and he said it in front of a pool of reporters. And I don't know why they don't have the whole quote in here, because I'm almost certain that the original quote is, "The Oklahoma City bombing saved my presidency." That was the way that he phrased it.
And that
Because
that
it
makes
just
me think.
absolutely took all the heat off of him and off of the state, and it made, right-wing radical private citizens the true enemy of society.
Yeah.
They even made a movie about it, Arlington Road, with Tim Robbins and I'm so bad at these actors, man. Not Kurt Russell, the other guy who's like Kurt Russell.
Michael. I know the two that I get confused. Michael
Anyway,
Martin Sheen.
We got the title, Arlington Road, though.
Arlington Road, and it's about a professor who's like an anti-terrorist professor, and then there's a guy in the neighborhood who's a right-wing anti-government extremist who commits an act of terrorism and frames him for it and stuff. Tim Robbins is the anti-government extremist. And in that movie, the most radical right-wing anti-government extremist thing that Tim Robbins says that shows what a terrorist he is, he says, "We deserve the truth." That's the most
what a radical.
That's the worst thing that he says in the whole movie. That shows what a horrible right-wing person he is. And if you know somebody like that, he's probably got a bomb in his trunk.
Right. Well, and that was the thing. Like when I was looking into Ruby Ridge and Waco, probably the most disheartening thing about it were all of the like Vox Salon, that type of journalism.
Yeah.
I would
Conventional
get
wisdom.
right. I would get into these, but they were written like the year before, so they were fresh, and they were still blaming Sammy Weaver on getting shot because of who his dad was. And I was just like, how are you people still saying this? Like, how did you say it in the first place? And so like, it's you talking about how Bill Clinton had said that the bombing saved his presidency. That does make me think of another claim that I heard. I've never substantiated, but I'm talking to Scott Horton, so I'm sure you actually do know this. I heard that in one of the Bush's memoirs that it was directly mentioned that H.W. had told George W. Bush that if he wanted to stay president and go into a second term, he had to have a war going on.
Sort of, but strike that and reverse it. It was Junior said that to his father. You got to go all the way to Baghdad. You don't want to end the war too soon because you want to make sure that you're in the middle of a war come re-election time, which is what a lot of people said at the time. But Bush Sr. had essentially boxed himself into a situation where he had this massive United Nations coalition that had a very limited mandate to force Iraq out of Kuwait. And if he continued on to Baghdad, then Syria and Egypt and all the other Arab states who were involved and would have objected. And the Soviet Union, which was in the middle of falling apart but had not ceased to exist yet, it would have, possibly jeopardized relations with them because he had promised the Russians he wasn't going to go further than the mandate, this kind of thing. And frankly, I think they were really afraid what was going to happen if they went all the way to Baghdad and how they were going to control the situation. So they called it off. But the problem was Bush Sr., we're talking about now, 1991, his approval rating at the end of Iraq War I was something like 90%. It was incredible. Mm-hmm. But the election wasn't for another year and a half. And he lost. Because by the time in 1992, nobody cared what a big war hero he was for saving the king of Kuwait. Who cares about that? And then we're in the middle of the war recession from the bubble popping from the money that they created to make the war seem free. And so, he had to pay that price. So then W learned that lesson. And it was, and this is to him, this counts to W. Bush as real deep thinking. That you got to be in the middle of a war. Mm-hmm. And so, and I have the quote in the new book. He told, when he was the governor, he told his biographer, Mickey Herskowitz, if I have a chance to attack Iraq, I'm going to take it. Because what you want to do is you want to be in the middle of a war. It's got to be kind of a small, easy war, but you want to be in the middle of it for your reelection. And then, so Mickey Herskowitz, put that out. I forgot exactly how this happened. I think maybe they went ahead and published the original ghost-written autobiography of the governor, or they were about to, or something. And then they scrapped it and fired him and they brought in someone new. And Karen Hughes wrote the book for W. And they got rid of this Herskowitz. And then later he put that quote out and said, he told me this. I got it on tape. You know, he told me this. And then, by the way, so Bush Sr., after that, Bush Sr. hired this same guy, Herskowitz, to write the biography of Prescott Bush, his father, the senator. So apparently they didn't think that he was a horrible liar who had, you know, put these false words in W's mouth, because they went ahead and kept him on for another major family project after that. And I think Bush did try to dispute the quote, but it's so obvious that it's true. And you know, I was remembering this recently, that Bill Kristol, and I didn't know who Bill Kristol was at the time yet, is this kingpin in the neoconservative movement.
Yeah.
I just knew he was a Republican hawk, but he doesn't look like a Republican. He looks like a Democrat, you know, which is, I don't know.
So he was raised by a Trotskyite.
I guess so. Yeah. And that's not like a Jewish thing, right? Because I don't think he looks particularly Jewish. If there's such a thing as a particularly Jewish look, he looks like just a white guy, right? Bill Kristol.
Yeah.
So I don't mean it like that. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me, because that's not what I'm saying. He just
Didn't sound like that.
he didn't remind me of like James Baker III. That's what I thought of as the Republicans at the time. And of course, right, he's the son of a Trotskyite, right? Like these guys all came from the radical left. And so he is a bit different than what I had, you know, been raised to expect to see as a Reaganite, you know? So anyway, but I remember Bill Kristol in the 90s saying, listen, and this is, and I like glommed onto this. I knew that this was right. And I went around repeating it to people, that this is absolutely the case, that as Bill Kristol put it, and Kristol wanted this to happen, was rooting for him. But if W. Bush wins the election of 2000, then great, because then it's guaranteed that he will have to go back to Iraq. Because look at the embarrassment of the father losing after 4 years and only being a one-term president, and leaving office with Saddam Hussein still in the chair, laughing at him over in Iraq. And so now, 8 years later, an entire presidency later, two-term presidency later, now the son is going to come sitting, you know, and be the president and sitting in this chair. There's no way that he can take the risk, because he's not a dictator, right? He's got to stand for election. Yeah. So there's no way he can take the risk that after 4 years, he will also be a one-term loser president like his father, and Saddam Hussein will still be in the chair laughing at his ass. No way. Even if he's going to lose after 4 years, it's going to be 4 years after killing Saddam Hussein and making sure that that is not a possibility. And I just knew that that was right. That, and at least that would be the argument of the Hawks. That one, you're right. You got to be in the middle of a war to make sure you win re-election, which worked for W. Bush in 2004, by the way. But also that, imagine the family embarrassment if you took the risk and you were unelected after 4 years and Saddam Hussein was still there. You can't do that. You absolutely have to go to Iraq one way or the other. And then look, Paul O'Neill, his first Treasury Secretary, said at the first cabinet meeting, Bush said, look, find me a way to attack Iraq. We're going to Iraq. That was at the first two cabinet meetings. That was all that they discussed.
If I could just real quickly go back for some clarity about something. When you're talking about Timothy McVeigh, he was a veteran of the first Iraq War. And he personally himself, whether this is true or not, it's just what he said, that the events that he witnessed during the Iraq War radicalized him against the government. And then the events of Waco and Ruby Ridge, specifically the children being killed at Waco and Ruby Ridge, were what brought his ire to the point where he was willing to do something violent to the government. And that placing that truck in front of that building was only the result of the truck not fitting into the parking deck of the other building that they intended to hit. And that he didn't actually mean to kill these children.
No, I don't
and
think
so
that's true.
So yeah, and so you were saying that he was like a confirmed neo-Nazi. And so that is different from the story that I heard, which was that they investigated and found that he was not part of any racial radical groups. Now, of course, that's what they investigated and found. But my question is, if his motivations for radicalization were both the killing of children at Waco and Ruby Ridge and the massacre of civilians at Iraq, it doesn't seem to fit the character of this person to intentionally try to bomb children or to even be a Nazi. Like,
Nah, I mean, look, it's revenge. It's payback.
Yeah.
If somebody kills your kid and you go, I'm upset about that, that doesn't preclude the idea. I don't mean to say you. If someone kills one's kid, well,
Yeah.
I mean, but that it changes the scenario. So I don't mean it like that. If somebody kills one's kid, someone could be upset about that and then turn right around and kill the killer's kid as revenge.
Yeah.
And think, yeah, of course it's wrong. That's why I did it. Right. So, the idea that he was angry at what had happened at Waco would prevent him from doing the same thing, I don't think is the right logic. His idea was, this is a target and I'm going to destroy it. It's full of ATF agents. It's full of government employees, and their kids are collateral damage. And that was actually a real quote of his, that they're collateral damage. Well, who taught him that? The U.S. Army. When you kill a target in war, sometimes civilians die. So, and that's the whole thing about the difference between living in a civilization or being in a state of war, right? Like Bugs Bunny says. Of course, you realize this means war. That means that the normal rules are canceled. And now we're going to do it this way instead of that way. And so for these guys, yeah, absolutely was paid. In fact, there's a George Carlin bit that I guess it's not from a routine, but it's from his book Brain Droppings, and he did the audiobook of it. I listen to a lot of Carlin when I'm flying around. And he has a thing about that, about how they called it domestic terrorism. And he goes, that's really not right, because domestic terrorism is usually like a campaign, and it's meant to provoke this kind of cycle of reaction and counter reaction and all this stuff. Oklahoma was more just, I'm going to murder you back and see how you like that, was basically what happened. And I guess there is a narrative that says that they were ignorant of the daycare center and that that was counterproductive, not morally wrong, but counterproductive because it made them the bad guy in a way that it would not have been if it was only adult government employees who had died, which we're talking about a bunch of little old ladies at the Social Security Administration and the Interior Department. And I mean, this is insane. But I guess there's an argument maybe that they didn't know, but you know, I've read that, I mean, they cased the building plenty. They had to have known that there was a daycare center there.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they didn't realize that that was going to be the main headline, was that the children had been killed or whatever.
And I think,
but as far as McVeigh's ties to these Nazis, there's plenty of evidence to tie him to the Aryan Republican Army and to Elohim City and all of these guys, and including informant.
Yeah, they have him there. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right though about him. He had a real hard time in Iraq. The stories, there's different versions of all of this, but one of the stories is he blew a guy's head off at range with a gun, and everybody said, "Hey, great shot, McVeigh." And he thought to himself immediately, like, "Oh my God, I just killed a man, and I'm in his country, and what the hell am I doing?" You know. And then, in fact, there's a book out that I have not read this. I know it's like 900 pages or some massive effort by Wendy Painting. But I saw there's this really interesting leftist that I follow on Twitter who read her book and was like tweeting it out important parts of it. And one of the things that I guess she had found was a lot of the information about his role in Iraq War I and how he had been involved in the slaughter, the so-called Battle of Rumelia, where they had, you know, massacred all of these civilians and all of these things. And so, yeah, I think that apparently that really played a large role in radicalizing his politics when he came back home. And this happens a lot. You know, we have a lot of great libertarians come from the war veterans of these wars, and they get home and realize how lied to they've been. But you know what? They don't always become libertarians. You know what I mean? A lot of times veterans come home, they realize how betrayed and used they've been, and their politics get very radical and very destructive ways. And sometimes they do become neo-Nazis and start running around with these guys. And, you know, again, it comes back to the prisons, too. Because you have people thrown in jail for petty crimes. Now they're soldiers. Their only skill in life is being a tough guy and fighting. Now they're locked up in a cage on some stupid possession charge or something like this. But then in the prison system, it's even official, where they divide people by race and all of that kinds of things. And so then everybody, it's a matter of joining a gang for protection. You got people who never even considered Nazism in their whole life, all of a sudden are in a Nazi gang because it's the only way to survive prison. and that kind of
So-
thing. And that's where I think a lot of these movements really come from.
Why do you think that even though the conditions that supposedly have created Timothy McVeigh are so much, have increased so much since his time, like those exact conditions have been the conditions for many thousands at this point, why have we not seen more events like this?
I don't know. I'm grateful for it that
No,
there have. I mean,
sure.
there have been. I mean, there have been a lot of soldiers who have moved pretty far to the right, and joined, you know, some outright racist movements and stuff like that. But you know, mostly not. I mean, honestly, I think maybe part of the answer is that just like in the 1990s, as I was saying, with the militia movements really not being Nazis, that I think you have that here too. You have the Proud Boys and the 3%ers and the help me out. I'm spacing out. I know there's one other major.
Boogaloo?
The Boogaloo boys. So these guys
yeah.
they're like radical rights. They're to the right of the libertarians and to the right of the Republicans for sure, but they're not
Right.
Nazis. So I think they kind of they're like the buffer. I think they catch a lot of guys who then they come home and join the modern version of the 90s militias who, again, did not sit around talking about blacks and Jews. They had different problems in that. And they might have complained about, you know, mass immigration from Latin America and that kind of thing. But that's not necessarily Nazism. That's just conservatism at that point, you know.
So I actually grew up in northern Michigan, and as you might imagine, around quite a lot of militia people. And I have very clear memory of Oklahoma City. I was 9 years old, and we were swimming in a lake in Upper Michigan, and my grandmother came running out onto the deck, screaming for us to get back into the house. Because this event, even though we were in Michigan, this event happening on TV was terrifying to her because nothing like this had ever happened before. And she thought we were in danger and needed to come get us. And what you were saying, two familiar phrases from my own childhood, was we can't blame, it wouldn't be fair to blame the Muslims. We don't know that the Muslims did this, was something I remember hearing that day, either from the television or from someone around me. And then secondly, was the deep need of the militia members in my world to disassociate themselves from racism and racist movements and saying, this isn't us, this isn't what we're about. This guy made us all look terrible. And I remember that very, very clearly, pointing out how he's a lone wolf. He did this on his own. He was, you know, not associated with us in any way. And that was a very emotional time for people.
And back to your question too, I think it may be that this would not have happened at all if it had not been for FBI agent provocateurs infiltrating these groups and pushing them on to do this. The worst thing that the radical right has been accused of lately is this plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. But it is, you know, obvious that there are huge questions about how much of this was the FBI and the informants doing in setting this whole thing up. And look, if you're that easy to entrap in a plot like that, then you're at least guilty of felony stupidity, but maybe not really that guilty of plotting to kidnap the governor. In this case, and this is not conclusive, but I think there's a lot. I think there really is a lot to it. And my gut tells me that this is really what's right. Is Andre Karl Strassmeyer was a German army intelligence officer who had infiltrated the radical right in the U.S. was working for the CIA and the DEA and basically was a cutout for American federal police agencies to infiltrate the radical right. And then I think that there's plenty of compelling evidence, not a conclusive case, but plenty of compelling evidence that the entire bombing at least sprang from, if it's not the entire kind of story, that at least it originated, that the plot itself originated as something that was spurred on by this agent provocateur who had encouraged McVeigh to do it and possibly had conspired with him and helped him to do it, and then was spirited out of the country and essentially was let go. But at the time, especially back then, everybody was pointing fingers. All these right-wing militia guys like you're talking about, they were like, Strassmeyer at Elohim City, he's the one, not us, it was him. And it was like, they all knew that he was the guy Because again,
Yeah.
they were all just a couple of steps of Kevin Bacon away from the dude. So they knew that it wasn't us, it was them. And now, no, so, so people don't read me wrong there. I don't think that I'm not saying that they had a plan like, yes, let's get our own building blown up. I think the idea, most likely the Occam's razor thing would have been that we'll get these guys to conspire to do something terrible and criminal, and then we'll bust them.
Right.
But then the thing fell apart, and the
Right.
bust never happened, and the crime took place anyway. And that seems to be the most reasonable explanation for what happened there, that they provoked it as a big sting, and then the whole thing went to shit.
Yeah. And one of the things is, you said I got pissed off. I didn't know we'd talk about Oklahoma City, and I'm like, I'm sorry for pissing you off. But I think that may be one of the things that I appreciate most about you, is the fact that you piss me off about all the right things. All the things that I should be pissed off about, you tell me about. And I really appreciate that. And like I said, when I did the red pills and when I was looking into that, I kept running into all of these apologies, like apologetics for why the Branch Davidians deserve to die, why the Sammy Weaver or Vicky Weaver should have been shot because of who she was married to, because they decided to get away, whatever. And then what was interesting about it is, as I was reading that, one of the ideas that kept coming to mind, and one of the things that I kept thinking about, are all of the apologetics for the nuking of Japan.
Yeah.
And that's something that came to my mind, because I was like, this is the same kind of programming of how we make the enemy. And even some libertarians out there will talk about how it was right to nuke Japan and it wasn't a terrorist action. And that's what I think. I don't know if it pisses you off as much as it does me, because that's like the thing that pisses me off the absolute most, are people who apologize for horrendous, horrible things. Like,
you know what, man? There's a study come out. They just did a poll, said the number of Americans who identify China as America's greatest enemy has doubled from 25% a year ago, 1 year ago, to now 50%. Half of America says China's our greatest enemy. Well, what's China done in the last year? Nothing. The only thing that's changed is more propaganda on TV about China, period. There's not new things that they have done that change anything. It's all just public relations. Whose side are you on? Worse, it's all social psychology. Mm-hmm. Are you with them or are you with us? Are you on this side or are you with that side? Go back to Iraq War II. I know you guys were young, but you remember about how this was. Yeah. That essentially the entire right half of the American population could not understand or believe or countenance for a moment. They could not fathom how it was that the other half of America didn't want to go and fight the country that attacked us on September 11th.
Right.
The level of contempt that the right held for the entire left half of the country, right? 150 million people. Well, you can all go to hell. You don't want to fight back against the Iraqis who attacked us? Screw you. You go to hell and you die, as Mr. Garrison said, right? And then the other half of the American population was saying, no, you stupid sons of bitches. Iraq didn't do it. That's why we don't want to attack them. Of course, if Iraq did do it, then we'd be having a whole different conversation, right? But on the right side, the idea was, you're a hippie, you're a homo, you're a traitor. You hate America and we hate you. You don't want to fight back. You don't want to defend this country against our terrorist enemies. And it's because they're stupid and wrong, frankly. But because their frame of reference, their initial premises were all wrong. Mm-hmm. Then they continued to make extremely lousy conclusions, right? So it's the same thing with nuking Japan. It's the same thing with anything. Same thing with being afraid of China right now. Your dad and your Uncle Bob and your minister and your coach and all the guys at the gym say we should fight China. I heard they're genociding the Uyghurs. Now, Are you a hippie? Are you a commie and you hate America and you got to sit there and explain to all these people that no, guys, it's just the war party is raping you in your brain butt again and you're letting them again, right?
Yeah.
Or you're just going to sit there and say, yeah, them damn, yellow peril coming our way and whatever. And it's just easier to go along and people just go along. They don't know it. Not your dad and your Uncle Bob and your gym coach and your mister. They don't know the first thing about the Xinjiang province or what's going on there. They just know that that's what they're supposed to say because they heard that crap on Fox News. Oh, the full-on Gong cult publishes this thing that claims this and good enough for me. And the same thing again, going back to nuking Japan. You know what's the number one best way to explain to a right-winger why it's not right, why it was wrong to nuke Japan? In fact, it's really funny. You can see this happen. You could do this as a social experiment. Someone should do a TV documentary about this where it's like the man on the street thing. First, you tell them how wrong it was to nuke Japan, and you make them so mad that they want to fight because they can't believe it because their dad and their minister and their Uncle Bob and everybody says, of course, we got to nuke these guys. And why would we have done it if we didn't have to do it? And what are you talking about? Why do you hate America so much, right? And then you explain to them that, guess what? Admiral Leahy and General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz and Paul Nitze, who was, I guess, a captain at the time. All of these right-wingers, including MacArthur, including Curtis LeMay, said we didn't have to do that. They were against it. Now, I left out Nimitz. If Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Leahy and General MacArthur and Curtis LeMay were against nuking Japan, well, then you're a fucking idiot if you're for it, aren't you?
Yeah.
Why would General MacArthur be against nuking anybody?
Right.
If it needed to be done? You think he would withhold that if he thought it was necessary? Curtis LeMay, who burned all of Tokyo to the ground with napalm, said, we didn't have to hit them with that awful thing. No, that was Eisenhower. That was General Eisenhower, the 5-star general, supreme allied commander of all NATO forces in Europe in World War II. Later, 2-term Republican president. So we didn't have to hit them with that awful thing.
Yeah.
So now it's Ike and Nimitz and Leahy and MacArthur and I say LeMay again? And all of them versus your right-wing Uncle Bob. Now who's a hippie and a commie and doesn't know what the hell they're talking about? And that's the reality of the situation. It was the Democrats that did that. And the American conservative movement roundly condemned it. And you can read it, the American Conservative magazine. I forgot who wrote this now. There's a great article about how all of the right-wing Catholic papers and the right-wing Protestant papers and the Sunday Morning Post and everybody opposed it. Everybody said that Truman, Zora Neale Hurston called Truman the butcher of Asia and said he was a war criminal, no different than the Japanese he defeated. But, screw that, dude, because you know what? In 5th grade, they said that true man would not have done it if he didn't have to, and that's all you need to know. And Jane Fonda and some tie-dye stoners said that we didn't. And so whose side are you on? You on the same side as your minister, or you're on the same side of this dope-smoking white guy with dreadlocks? Right? And then so you make your pick. And it's all about social psychology. It's not about what happened to the Japanese. It's not about the decision that Truman made to impress Stalin by nuking a bunch of civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, including obliterating the Christian movement in Japan that was centered in Nagasaki, of course, and including in both cities had American POWs there. Which, by the way, interestingly, all the American POWs in Nagasaki survived simply by jumping into a ditch, which just goes to show that they're not terribly effective military weapons. They're good for indiscriminate mass murder of innocent civilians. You drop one on a city center, but in terms of infantry, there are loopholes like trenches.
Well, it wasn't a weapon; it was a message, as far as my understanding goes.
Yeah, and there's a great historian called Gar Alperovitz, and I've interviewed him before, and I think he's done the most and best work on this. But there's plenty of work has been done on this, where they said in their own language that they did this to impress Stalin, to let him know that we had it. And the Japanese had been surrendering, had been attempting to sue for peace since March.
Right.
Well, yeah, and that's what's interesting is because, like I said, I've seen so-called libertarians arguing this point, and they're like, well, that's all that could have been done. There was no surrender that was going to happen, and like there are all of these things that you heard when you were in 5th grade, but that if you go, well, what
But
really
the Soviets
happened?
were coming. What do you mean there's no surrender was going to happen? They were about to have the Red Army marching across their entire chain of islands. They preferred to surrender to the Americans. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
They had no ability. And people say, it was funny because the number just gets inflated over and over and over to the point where by the time of George H.W. Bush, he said 1 million American soldiers and Marines would have died invading Japan. Where, come on. And all of their worst estimates were that 50,000 would die. And we're talking about combatants. And it's true that they were conscripts and fighting age males, and that ain't quite fair. But still, you're talking about dropping a nuke on a city. And for good libertarians who want to know, the libertarian heritage of of our analysis as a movement on this, is read Hiroshima and Nagasaki by Ralph Rako. And Ralph Rako says, now, wait a minute. If our guys had just gone and rounded up all the men, women, and children of Hiroshima in the center of town and machine gunned them to death like the Gestapo, would that have been okay? Because when the Gestapo did that, we said that was what proved that the Gestapo was the Gestapo. That was what was bad about them. That was what proved how illegitimate of a force they were and how righteous our cause was in destroying them. So would it have been fine to round up the men, women, and children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and machine gun them to death in the town square? And if not, then how's it any better to do fission over their head?
Right.
It's
and a lot of people,
it's worse only.
Yeah. Well, but that's a way that most people don't think about it. When they think of, I think that most people don't have any clue of what kind of devastation that was, because it's not something they've ever experienced.
I'll tell you this too. About a year and a half ago, a guy sent me super high quality scans, like ultra high quality scans of panorama pictures of all of Hiroshima that his grandfather took.
Oh, wow.
In other words, I have on my computer right now the best, worst pictures of the aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing that anyone has ever seen.
Yeah.
I
You
got
don't
them.
see that.
And I'll tell you, and I can't share them. But you can look up Hiroshima 1945 in your Google images and you can see plenty.
There's a documentary. There's a documentary called White Flash, Black Rain that I thought really brought life to what had happened, because these were people, they were individuals, they were conducting their whole lives. And
I read a thing that if you dig a couple of feet down, there's bones everywhere in Hiroshima right now. You can't do anything without disturbing human remains.
The images of people walking down the street that had been basically like photo blasted onto the sides of buildings because their shadow just momentarily blocked the light that was otherwise scalding the face off of this building. I mean, it's really, I think every time I see someone defending that event as something that needed to happen, I tell them to watch that documentary. I don't think anybody has, but I think if you did watch it, you would have a really hard time saying this was a justified action.
That's cool. You send me a link to that?
Absolutely.
Great. I'd love to see that.
And it makes me, like, you talking about rounding up the men, women, and children and shooting them. It makes me think about because My Lai, that was an example of something smaller than what happened at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but it's not talked about enough. But the My Lai massacre is, anytime anyone hears about it, they go, well, that was obviously wrong. That was obviously bad. But it was, and it obviously was, but at the same time, it paled in comparison to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Or the whole war, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when we talk about Vietnam, we go, well, somewhere between 3 and 5 million people were killed. Well, how many My Lais is that? I'm not good at decimal points live on the air. 500 killed versus 5 million. They bomb Laos every day for 10 years for no reason at all. There's the footage. You can see this. It's in American Holocaust. I'm almost certain it's in American Holocaust, where they show the congressional testimony of the Air Force captain. And he says, he's essentially explaining that he kept bombing Laos for years and years and years, even though he had no targets. And the congressman says, what do you mean? You had no targets. You just kept bombing them anyway for years? And he goes, well, they kept sending me bombs. I had to get rid of them. I couldn't just let them pile up on the tarmac. And so then that was it. And they're just blasting people, just blowing them apart by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands for years and years and years and years on end. When they got no enemies to fight, they're just out there getting rid of ordnance so they can replenish it. I mean, talk about a self-licking ice cream cone. And when people talk about Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and killed by the Americans and the results of the American war there, the estimate is somewhere between 3 and 5 million. And then, so yeah, I mean, this is the thing of it, right, man? It is the American government still thinks, and you listen to these people, they believe it.
Yep.
They still think that America is Christopher Reeve's Superman, you know, the total Boy Scout who just, we do nothing but go around all day selflessly saving kittens from trees and helping little girls and being friends. But for the rest of the world, they're looking at this and saying, that's not right. I mean, think about when America supports Suharto overthrowing Sukarno, and then supports Suharto going around and murdering 500,000 Indonesians, rounding up anybody who leans left and murdering them. And then the East Timorese too, which is really a separate nation that they just occupied and stole and just butcher these people. Well, that's Americans gave the green light for all of that. This is the American world empire. Indonesia is a part of it. And when the Indonesian government does this, you know, virtual auto genocide, that's on us. That's our government. That's Henry Kissinger went over there under Gerald Ford and gave him the green light to go after the Timorese. Go ahead, man. We got your back. We'll make sure nobody does anything about it. Now look at what's going on in Yemen right now. I guarantee you when this thing's over and they're done counting the excess death and all of that, we're talking probably 750,000 dead, maybe more than that. And the official numbers now are 250,000 dead, but it's got to be double that. Absolutely has to be at least double. And it just goes on year after year after year. And they asked Donald Trump, why are we doing this? He says, for the money.
Yeah.
And he makes up this ridiculous number. The Saudis are spending $450 billion on American weapons. Yeah, over the next century, they are $450 billion. What a bunch of crap. They spend about $4 billion a year. $4 billion, which is nothing. Which, if you took that away from the American economy, would hurt the dividend receivers of the Raytheon stock owners and no one else at all.
Yeah.
You know, and then this just goes on decade after decade after decade. And where your fifth grade teacher will tell you that nuking Hiroshima is inarguable. Of course it was the right thing to do. Otherwise, why'd we do it? And as you talked about, you know, radicalized soldiers coming home. It's a big part of it. Soldiers join right out of high school, pretty much 17, 18 years old. They've been told the whole time to expect their enemies essentially are the German army. They're going to meet them in the field out there in France somewhere, where everyone they engage is an enemy in a gray coat who deserves to die, who serves Hitler and is the enemy of mankind. And you're going to be out there wearing olive green, which is your loophole through the thou shalt not kill commandment from God, the creator of the universe. And that says that, no, as long as you're wearing olive green and you're doing it for your country, it's the right thing. And you learn in government school your whole life that your government is your country. And the politicians who run your government, they're the best people that we could have, or they wouldn't be there. And they were chosen by the people to make these decisions because they're the best people to make these decisions. And they wouldn't make the decisions they make if they weren't the right decisions to make. Otherwise, why would they make them? And so there's just layers upon layers upon layers of legitimacy baked into the whole thing. Then they get over there and they're like, dude, I'm patrolling Pashtun Minutemen in their own neighborhood. I call them the Taliban, like they're the foreign invaders. But it's their neighborhood and I'm the foreign invader. And my buddy just died with his guts all over the ground. And what the hell are we even doing here? on the literal other side of the planet, 180 degrees away from the middle part of North America where they're from. And they come home all shell-shocked, and they come home finally now understanding that they weren't fighting for freedom. They weren't fighting to protect their little sister from violence. They weren't fighting to save the sacred Bill of Rights. They were being used.
Yeah.
And to do, in many cases, terrible things, to participate in horrible acts of violence against other people. And then it burns like hell. You know, that's the whole thing. The gap between the truth and the narrative is so vast.
Mm-hmm.
And people, this is why it's funny. I kind of am bothered by this, but I guess it's a huge thing, not just in the libertarian movement, but kind of all over the place, about the red pill and that metaphor from the Matrix, where you stop believing in all this bullshit all of a sudden and recognize that everything is different than they told you that it was. Yeah. And I think Bill Hicks is right about this. I mean, people really need to do psychedelics at least once or twice or 3 times or some kind of thing, just so you can hear your own voice questioning whether you really think the things you think or whatever, just for a minute, you know? And I think people, they just get so stuck behind looking through their own eyeballs, and they don't have the ability to catch that third person point of view until something really traumatic happens. Some like really life shattering event comes and smacks them upside the head, sometimes a lot harder than they're ready for, you know? But, and it's going to be a problem. I mean, it's, it is a problem for a lot of guys. And, you know, we haven't had big Oklahoma City type events, but I think, well, more and more you're going to see as the gap between the politics of the American people, and especially the more radical populist right and left, the gap between that and the ruling center elite grows, you know, larger and larger. I think that, yeah, you're going to see real problems, because what do you do with that many disaffected people, that many betrayed, and you know, they can't make money. The economy's destroyed. And even if the lockdowns hadn't happened last year, we were due for a major crash anyway. We've been riding on a massive inflationary bubble for 12 years. It had to come due. So, yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, America's got a lot of problems, and militarism is at the core of almost all of them.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's going to continue to make everything else worse, too. And by the way, I mean, Joe Biden's threatening to get us into a nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine right now. And, you know, never mind the stupid war on terrorism.
Right. I lost my train of thought.
It was probably going to be something about what?
No, it was, that's what you mentioned, COVID. And I think that probably the worst part of the coronavirus and what the government did with coronavirus was that you were supposed to have a Soho Forum debate with Bill Kristol in New York when I was living.
It's still going to happen.
But at that point, I was living in Pennsylvania, so it was something that I could have gone to physically. And I'm in Florida now. Like, it's
I know
a lot harder to get there.
And you know what? I mean, honestly, I hope he's not watching this, because I don't want to give away my whole game plan or whatever. But it would have been a lot funnier if Donald Trump had been the president at the time of the debate.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that it's Biden and now everything is back to normal and whatever is kind of makes it less hilarious. Because I was going to, my whole thing was going to be about how Donald Trump was Bill Kristol's son. And as much as Bill Kristol hates him, he literally personally is the only reason Donald Trump ever could become the president, is because the Washington establishment listened to Bill Kristol and invaded Iraq and blew America's entire wad and broke America's entire power in the sands of Mesopotamia, and reduced the Bush-Clinton centrist dynasty, you know, consensus to ashes.
Yeah.
And allowed for somebody who claimed to be a populist right-winger to win over the conservatives. I mean, look at John Kasich. By the book, John Kasich should have been the nominee. Good moderate centrist. And the people don't want that anymore. And why not? Because the good moderate centrists listen to Bill Kristol and ruin everything. And I had a whole great rap about it where it was going to be funny as hell too. So we still might debate, and I believe Gene is pushing for next month. I haven't
Oh,
heard
man.
anything for a while, but he wants it to be this May instead of last May. So I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but I'm ready, Freddie.
Man.
Put me on a plane. I'll get up there and do my best anyway. I don't know.
And what was funny is I found that out because I just happened to be on the Soho forum, like, and I saw you and Bill Crystal, and I was like, wow.
I don't know. You know what?
I really want that to happen. I was actually surprised that he would do it.
Nah, I wasn't. I mean, he's a very self-confident guy, if nothing else.
Okay.
You know, Bolton wouldn't. You know, Young Americans for Liberty tried to get Bolton to debate me, and his people refused.
I'm sure they did.
But you know,
I will not debate Scott Horton.
You know, I'm not that good of a debater. I've only actually been in one debate before. And of course, I pretty much only interview good guys on my show. I don't really want to fight with the bad guys on my show. So I just, you know, interview the guys who deserve the coverage.
I feel that.
And I did a debate back in 2008 and I beat the neocon pretty handily, but I also didn't listen to him. I was like looking at my notes and trying to think of what to say. And I missed a bunch of crazy shit that he said that I should have responded to and whatever. Anyway, I learned a lesson or two from that. But I don't know how it would go. Honestly, I've never been in like, this is the way it's supposed to be, is like, oh, you get 15 minutes and he gets 15 minutes and then he gets a rebuttal and you get a rebuttal and then you ask each other questions and the audience questions and all this. Like, I've never done something like that. Bill Crystal's been in 100 of those. Although he's always going against people who would recommend restraint and realism versus a more interventionist type thing in a way that's very professional and professorial, where mine is a more morality based kind of a foreign policy, as the neoconservatives might say.
Right. And I think that that's why I connect with you in a lot of ways, is because my move from being in the family who wanted Bush more than 2 times to being an anarchist was because I heard Dr. Paul make his speech Imagine, where he talked about, put yourself in the shoes of the people in Afghanistan. He talked about if China came to Texas, how would we respond? And it was that moral conversation that changed how I thought about most things. It was, and then seeing, I think probably one of the most heartbreaking things to me, because I've had a lot of these like personal lessons when it comes to these horrifying things in life. And one of them was, I had a really good friend who was a good Christian boy, was a very nice kid. And then he joined the army and he did a tour in Afghanistan, and he came back and he tells me this story. And I won't say his name because I hope he finds Jesus. But he sits down and he's telling us the story about how he drove the Humvee through the city and that he was not supposed to stop the Humvee for any reason because of IEDs or whatever the reason is. He's not supposed to stop. And he told me about the time that some kids were running across the road and he sped up a little and ran over one of them and was laughing as he told me this. This was a person who I'd known and was a fairly good person. And he came back a monster. And that was another one of where I was like, these are the things we should hate. These are the things that the state does to dehumanize people to the point of not looking human anymore. And that's why I appreciate you coming on and you doing what you do, doing 5,500 interviews. If everyone should be listening to on Friday for your 5,500th interview, but you doing what you do, and in some sense, what we do is we're trying to find, like as Malice talks about the white pill, we try to find the silver lining. We try to find the little bit of hope that we can act out, the little bit of fight we can do to beat these things. So I deeply appreciate you coming on. But one of my questions that I ask everyone who comes on is, what is it out there that gives you hope that we can, in some, even the smallest ways, come up against this immorality, this degeneracy, this horror, and come out the other side feeling like we've done something?
I want to know what gives Scott Horton hope.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I guess war is a government program. So, eventually that's what's so bad about it. It's why it's always so disastrous. But essentially it means that, they undermine faith in their own project, with their reaction. I don't know how anybody can believe them anymore. I mean, the polls show super majorities of the population say we never should have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan at all. And not just that they want home now, but we never should have even done that. So it's just a matter of, we need to help people prioritize this as something that really is what matters most. Militarism is at the root of so many of our own problems here in America. And it really should be the thing that the progressive left and the constitutionalist right, led by the libertarians, can really get all of our act together to oppose and fix. I'm not naive, and I don't have $1 billion PR campaign to help make this happen or anything, but all of the potential is there.
Right.
But really, hope doesn't have much to do with it. I mean, frankly, it's wrong. So we got to fight it. And what are you going to do? Do your best. People do tell me regularly that they either didn't join or they left the service because of me. Or because of, people they heard on my show said a thing that made them think twice or whatever it was. So I'll take those little victories. I got one of those today on Twitter, a guy saying, he's leaving the service because of me. So I take those, or, that's a little bit of a boost. But ultimately, for the people who understand what the truth is, we have a responsibility to explain the truth to other people, because a lot of people, they need a translator, frankly, right, to explain what it is that's not true about what they're saying, why you don't have to believe in this, why you don't have to go along with the social psychology of this. Everybody says that you got to believe in this bullshit. You don't have to believe in this bullshit, and let them off the hook. Let them know that they don't have to. That was what was so important about George Carlin to me, was essentially what George Carlin said to me was like, come on, you don't have to believe in this, in any of it. They come to you and beating you over the head about what you have to believe. You don't have to believe that. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to. You don't have to keep anybody's counsel but your own about what you think is right or what you think is true. And so I think that's our job, right? Is just showing people that you don't have to give in to this kind of pressure, and that and once you don't feel like you have an obligation to go along with it, then it's pretty easy to see through the rest, right? Like you're telling your story about Ron Paul. Once Ron Paul got you to break from the grip of the pressure of conforming with that side, with that side's point of view, well, boy, you learned a lot real quick about what's really happening instead, right? Because you're not constrained by that anymore.
Well, what's funny about that is
I
made the mistake of going to college. So I had a lot of student debt. And right after, like around the same time, I had been looking, one of my friends was really pushing me to join the Navy. And he said, they'll pay off your college debt. You won't have that anymore. You can just do this. And I was thinking about that. And he set me up with a conversation with a recruiter for the Navy. And literally 3 days before, I heard that speech by Dr. Paul. And so I walked in and I talked to this Navy recruiter, and he was like, yeah, there's Afghanistan. And I just looked at him and I said, why are we in Afghanistan? And the dude couldn't answer the question, because he gave kind of these things. And I was like, no, really, why are we there? And he couldn't answer it. And I was like, no, I'm not doing this, dude. And I was out. That's great. That's great. Because, like they have a lot of different ways to get people to do it. And they pulled on my strings and tried to sell me the bill of goods. And if it weren't for Dr. Paul, and then eventually you, Tom Woods, all of the greats, I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing, which is enjoying myself by like just beating on bad guys. Like that's my thing. I want to beat on bad guys. But we're happy to have you, man, on our side. We need you. Thank you. And you too. I didn't mean to say, man. You're just hiding behind the camera over here, I guess. But yeah, with that, I can't tell you how much I appreciate getting the chance to talk to you directly and just ask you what's in my head.
It's great to meet both you guys. Happy to do it anytime.
So with that, I do want to tell people, I mean, who doesn't know how to follow you that's in the libertarian or anarchist movement, but like I said, you have a lot. You have the Libertarian Institute, and which is libertarianinstitute.org. You are the editor-in-chief of antiwar.com. You have the Scott Horton show. You're on anti-war radio in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, on Pacifica 90.7 KPFK in LA.
You have 2 books. The newest one is Enough Already: In the War on Terrorism, and then Fool's Errand, which, by the way, yeah, I actually have I have the 2 digital copies, audio and the Kindle copy, because one day you tweeted out and you said, there's this thing, if you call your representative, I'll give you my audiobook for free. And I was like, you're in, I'll do that.
Oh, I remember that on the
Yemi
thing. Yeah.
And,
Cool.
and so I have that because you said, hey, could you do this thing? And I was like, yeah, if you're saying it's a good idea,
I should do that more often. I forgot about that.
It worked. Yeah. And I appreciate you. Is there anything else you want to tell people about that may not know what you're doing? Is there anything I missed?
No, not really. As far as that, I mean, I do hope people read the book, the blue one there on this side. Enough Already. That's everything I'm mad about. All the stuff I could tell you from all the wars, from Jimmy Carter all the way through Donald Trump. And so that's Fool's Errand was chapter 2 of Enough Already that kind of got out of control and turned into a whole book. And then I started over again. And so this is a brief take on 14 wars or so, and everything you need to know. So that's pretty much what I got for you there is Enough Already. And then I'm not taking credit for this. I am the editorial director of antiwar.com, but that page is the most important project on the internet. And if there's one thing that I had to leave you guys with, beseeching you to look at, it would be make sure to add antiwar.com to your schedule and look at it every day. We got so Jason Ditz and Dave DeCamp are our news writers, but we got this new guy, and I'm such an idiot. I'm spacing on his name real quick, but I'm going to find it for you here. This guy used to write for us like 25 years ago or 20 years ago. Rick Rosoff. He's great. And he is now also writing with Jason and with Dave DeCamp at news.antiwar.com. And they are covering, and they got original write-ups of like 10 stories a day now, every day. All the top headlines there is all the news. And then me and Kyle Anzalone are in charge of picking the viewpoints for you. And then our regular contributors, we now have Doug Bondo and Ted Carpenter, the 2 very best guys from the Cato Institute, are now writing for us at antiwar.com. Nice. We've got Danny Sherson, the great anti-war hero, the major who fought in Iraq War II and Afghanistan, is a great anti-war guy. We've got Ramzi Baroud, the brilliant Palestinian professor and intellectual writer. I'm sorry, there's a whole slew of our regular contributors now. We're just kicking as much ass as we ever have been. And frankly, antiwar.com is as important now as it's ever been. You'd almost skip Obama and Trump years. Man, it's as important now as it was during W. Bush, that we have a chance to really end the war on terrorism now. If we can all focus on this and prioritize this and insist on this, this is the thing. And then the next major challenge is that the Navy especially wants to pivot to Asia, and the Army and Air Force want to pivot to Eastern Europe. And they could kill us all in a nuclear war with 2 powers that we've been friends with for 50 and 30 years friends with for 50 and 30 years respectively. I have no reason to have a Cold War with whatsoever. So, we have huge challenges and responsibilities here to deal with in the Biden era. And so that's it. It's all the bad news and all of the best writers about all the bad news every day at Antiwar.
It is a strange day that I don't read what's on antiwar.com and LouRockwell.com. Like those are my go-tos. But like I said, I'll tell these people about all the exciting things and where to find us. But I genuinely cannot thank you enough for coming on.
Happy to
Yes,
do
sir.
it anytime, and great to
Absolutely an
meet
honor.
both of you.
Absolutely. And so, listeners, we have a lot of cool stuff still coming. We've got Mike Brancatelli. You mentioned, Scott, that people need to take psychedelics. We have Mike Brancatelli, who used to be the co-host of Part of the Problem and now has a show called Micadelic.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna
Yeah,
have-
I know who you're talking about. Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's going to be on next week, as well as Joshua Smith, who you talked to last night.
Mhm.
And then we have Clint from Liberty Lockdown after that, Carrie Wedler, and then finally for the first week of May, we've got Freckles and Brett. But if you want to find me at Cam Harless, if you want to find Scott at Scott Horton Show on Twitter, if you want to find Jessica, that's at Soup Canarchist. We do have a locals, themadOnes.locals.com. You can listen to us on wearethemadOnes.com or on mlganetwork.com. If you're listening to this and you want to see Scott Horton's beautiful face as we speak this entire time, youtube.com/themadOnes. And don't forget our lone and beautiful sponsor, Lorenzotti Coffee. If you go to lorenzotti.coffee and put in the promo code TheMadOnes, you get 10% off. So as always, dear audience, live the life you want to live. Fight the bad guys. And if anyone tells you any differently, tell them to go to hell.